The sergeant hands woman a mop, then freezes, seeing her black viper tattoo. The training hall echoed with the sound of boots striking the ground as the new recruits lined up. The air inside smelled faintly of metal and sweat, the kind of air that always carried the weight of discipline and order. Young men stood in uniform rows, their backs straight, their eyes forward, each one fighting against the nerves twisting in their stomachs. This was the first day many of them had been waiting for, the beginning of a journey into military life. Among those recruits stood a woman. Her uniform was just as sharp as the rest, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady, but her presence stood out. Not because she looked different, but because she carried herself with a calmness that seemed almost out of place among the jittery energy of the others. While the young men shuffled slightly or glanced nervously around, she remained still, as if she had already prepared herself for whatever test was to come. The heavy door creaked open and the sergeant stepped inside. His boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, his face stern, his eyes sharp. He had the kind of look that made people straighten without even realizing they were doing it. Years of service had carved authority into his very posture. He walked slowly down the line, inspecting the recruits, his silence pressing down on them more than shouting ever could. The sergeant stopped in front of the woman. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than the others. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. To him, she was not like the others. He had seen many women enter this hall, but only a few ever made it through the tests. Most quit, not because they lacked strength, but because the environment was built to break them down mentally before it ever tested them physically. He wanted to test her resolve right there. His eyes drifted toward the corner of the hall where an old mop leaned against a bucket. With a deliberate slowness, he walked over, grabbed the mop, and turned back toward her. The recruit shifted, sensing something was about to happen. Some exchanged amused glances, waiting for the scene to unfold. The sergeant stopped just inches away from the woman. His voice carried through the hall, cold and sharp. "Take it and mop, ape." The words struck like a stone dropped in still water. They rippled through the recruits, sparking quiet chuckles and smirks. To them, it was entertainment, a moment to laugh at someone else's expense. The sergeant's words carried more than an order. They carried mockery. In that single sentence, he had challenged her worth, questioned her place, and tried to strip her of dignity before she even had a chance to prove herself. The woman did not flinch. Her eyes locked onto his, calm but steady. She did not speak. For a moment, the room felt heavier, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if she would break. Would she lower her gaze? Would she refuse? Would she crumble under the weight of humiliation? Instead, she reached forward slowly, without hesitation. The recruits' laughter grew, their whispers sharp like knives. One of them muttered under his breath, "Guess she came here to clean, not fight." Another chuckled, shaking his head. The sergeant kept his gaze on her, waiting for a flicker of weakness, a crack in the mask. But as she reached out, something caught his eye. Her sleeve slid up just enough to reveal the ink etched into her forearm. His eyes narrowed, his smirk fading instantly. It was a black viper. The tattoo curled along her skin in bold, dark lines, its head poised as if ready to strike. To the recruits, it might have looked like any ordinary tattoo, but to the sergeant, it meant something far more. His body stiffened. His grip on the mop faltered for just a fraction of a second, a movement so small that only those watching closely could have noticed. He knew that tattoo. He had seen it before, not on just anyone, but on people who had survived trials that most would never even dare to attempt. It was a mark of survival, of endurance, of strength forged in suffering. For the first time in years, the sergeant's words caught in his throat. The woman's hand wrapped around the mop. She held it firmly, not as if it was a symbol of humiliation, but simply as an object, a task waiting to be completed. Her gaze did not waver, her posture did not falter. To her, the mop was not an insult. It was a challenge, and challenges were nothing new to her. The recruits' laughter slowly quieted as they noticed the change in the sergeant's expression. Confusion rippled through the group. They had expected him to push harder, to bark another insult, but instead he seemed caught off guard. His eyes lingered on the tattoo, his mind turning over memories he had tried to bury. He remembered men, tough, battle-worn men who had once worn that mark. He remembered their resilience, their refusal to give up even when pushed to the edge. And now, here it was again, on the arm of the very woman he had tried to humiliate. But she gave no explanation. She offered no words, no defense, no story. She simply held the mop, her silence speaking louder than any argument could. The recruits looked between the sergeant and the woman, sensing something they did not understand. To them, it was just a tattoo. To him, it was history. The hall grew quiet again. The woman turned, carried the mop toward the floor, and began to work. Each movement was precise, calm, and steady. She did not rush, and she did not drag her feet. She treated the task with the same focus she would give to anything else. The room watched, their amusement fading into something else, curiosity, confusion, maybe even respect. The sergeant stood still, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had tried to test her, to break her spirit before it had a chance to rise. But instead, he had been reminded of something he had forgotten, that true strength cannot be mocked away. For the recruits, it was a small moment. For the woman, it was another test passed, but for the sergeant, it was a warning. He had underestimated her, and that was a mistake he would not make again. The mop hit the bucket with a soft thud when she finished. She leaned it against the wall and stood tall once more, her gaze straight ahead, her posture unbroken. She had taken the insult, turned it into discipline, and walked away with her dignity untouched. And though no one said a word, the silence in the room spoke louder than any applause. The challenge had been given. The challenge had been met, and it was only the beginning. The air in the training hall was thick, though no one spoke. The recruits who had been whispering and laughing only moments ago were now shifting awkwardly in their boots, unsure what to make of what they had seen. The sergeant stood frozen in place, staring at the woman's arm as though the ink branded into her skin was more powerful than the uniform she wore. For years he had trained men and women to break them down before building them up. But rarely had he been caught off guard in his own arena of control, and yet one glance at the Black Viper had shaken him in a way the recruits could not see, but could somehow sense. The woman did not care about the whispers, the silence, or the eyes fixed on her. She had been under worse stares before, judging eyes in foster homes, dismissive eyes in schools, harsh eyes in workplaces where she had always been underestimated. She was used to being measured by what people thought she lacked, but what they did not understand was that every moment of dismissal had carved her into someone who no longer needed approval. That tattoo on her arm was not something she got to look tough or fashionable. It was something earned in the kind of trial that could strip away a person's soul. The sergeant's mind pulled him back years. He remembered standing in the mud, watching a group of men crawl through terrain so brutal it tore skin from bone. He remembered hearing about the initiation of the Viper trials, a brutal course designed for only the most resilient. Many went in, but only a fraction made it out. And those who did were branded with that very mark, the Viper coiled and ready to strike. It was not a tattoo you simply asked for. It was a tattoo that demanded survival, patience, and pain most people would never understand. For him, it was almost unthinkable that the young woman before him bore that mark. But there it was, stretched across her arm, clear and undeniable. The recruits were not old enough or seasoned enough to recognize its meaning. To them, it was just a snake, nothing more. They could not understand why their sergeant, a man known for his unshakable composure, stood staring as if someone had taken the wind from his lungs. But even if they did not understand the symbol, they began to understand the woman in front of them was not ordinary. She continued her work in silence, running the mop across the floor. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. It was not about the mop, not about the insult, not about the audience. It was about control. Controlling her emotions, controlling her response, controlling the power others thought they held over her. She had learned long ago that real strength was not in reacting to humiliation, but in mastering it. To fight the little battles with calmness was to prepare for the larger wars life would always throw at her. When she was younger, she had no control. Life dictated everything: where she lived, what she ate, who cared for her, and more often, who did not. The foster system had been an endless rotation of unfamiliar beds and faces that saw her as a temporary responsibility. Every time she started to feel settled, she was uprooted again. She learned early that the world was not going to hand her comfort or stability. It would hand her trials, tests, and pain, and it was up to her to decide what those experiences would carve out of her. The Viper was born from that decision. Years earlier, before the uniform and before the training hall, she had faced the Viper trials, Few talked about them and even fewer survived. It was not just a test of strength, but a test of endurance, patience, and mental willpower. There were days when food was scarce, nights when cold air bit into bone, and endless hours of silence where the mind itself became the enemy. To survive, one had to push past the screaming of muscles, the exhaustion of lungs, and the despair that whispered to quit. Those who endured did not come out unscarred. They came out transformed, and the Black Viper was a symbol of that transformation. The sergeant knew this. He knew because years ago he had lost a comrade in those same trials. He had watched men stronger than steel crumble to dust when faced with the relentless grind of the test, and now staring at the woman before him, he realized she had walked that same path and survived. In that moment, she was no longer the recruit he had mocked. She was someone who had already proven herself in ways most of his soldiers never would, and yet she did not flaunt it. She did not hold her arm out for recognition, did not explain its meaning, did not use it to demand respect. That was perhaps what made it even more powerful. Her silence spoke louder than words. She had nothing to prove, not to him, not to the recruits, not to anyone. The tattoo was not a badge for others to honor. It was a reminder to herself of what she had already conquered. The sergeant cleared his throat and straightened his posture, trying to recover his authority. But even in his silence, the recruits could see that something had shifted. The woman finished mopping, placed the mop carefully back against the wall, and returned to her spot in the line. She stood tall, her gaze forward, her hands at her sides. For a brief moment, the hall felt suspended in time. No one dared to laugh again. The smirks had vanished, replaced with something more uncertain. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even a budding sense of respect. They could not name it, but they could feel it. The balance of the room had changed. The sergeant's eyes lingered on her a moment longer. He had thought he was teaching a lesson, but instead he had been reminded of one himself. That strength was not always loud, not always visible, not always dressed in medals or ranks. Sometimes strength stood silently, carried its burdens without complaint, and proved itself not in words but in action. He moved on to the next recruit, barking out orders again, but the edge in his voice had softened. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The woman remained still, her expression calm, her breathing steady. Inside, she felt the same way she always had, that each moment of underestimation was not a weight but a stepping stone. She had carried heavier burdens than mops, endured harsher words than insults, and faced trials that had tried to bury her alive. This was nothing new. This was just another step forward. And though the day would continue, though more drills and challenges lay ahead, something important had happened in that hall. The recruits might not have understood it, and the sergeant might never admit it aloud, but the message had been clear. The Black Viper was not just a tattoo. It was a warning. It was a story etched in ink, carried by someone who refused to break. And as the sun began to set outside, painting streaks of light through the high windows of the hall, one truth became impossible to ignore. This woman was not here to be mocked, dismissed, or defeated. She was here to endure, to rise, and to lead. And whether they knew it or not, every person in that room had just witnessed the beginning of something far greater than themselves. The training base was quiet that evening, but her mind was not. As she lay on the stiff mattress in the barracks, the weight of the day pressed against her chest. Not because of the mop, not because of the sergeant's words, but because every insult always brought pieces of her past back to life. It was a past most would not believe, a past she rarely spoke of, yet it followed her like a shadow. Every challenge she faced in the present was tied to the battles she had already fought, long before she put on a uniform. Her struggle had begun long before the army, long before she had even known what the word discipline truly meant. She had been born into a world that was already stacked against her. Her earliest memories were not of bedtime stories or gentle care, but of loud voices, slammed doors, and long nights filled with fear. Her father had left before she could even form full sentences, and her mother, weighed down by her own pain and poor choices, disappeared not long after. She was left in the care of strangers, shuffled through foster homes where she was more of a name on a paper than a child with needs. In those homes, she learned quickly what it meant to be overlooked. Other children were chosen, adopted, or favored while she remained in the corner, quiet and forgotten. Sometimes foster parents treated her with distant politeness, feeding her, clothing her, but never truly seeing her. Other times the treatment was harsher, Harsh words, harsher rules, and the ever-present reminder that she was temporary, replaceable, and unwanted. She could not control who wanted her or who did not, so she learned to control the only thing she could: herself. At school, she was often the outcast. Children noticed when someone did not have parents waiting at the gate, or when their clothes were secondhand. They noticed when someone did not know where home really was. The teasing was constant, but she never cried in front of them. She swallowed every insult, every laugh, every cruel nickname. What others saw as coldness was not pride, it was survival. But survival, as she would learn, was not just about keeping quiet. It was about finding the fire inside that would carry her forward. That fire began to grow the day she discovered her strength, not just in her body, but in her will. While others sought comfort, she sought challenge. She pushed herself to run longer, climb higher, fight harder. When no one believed in her, she decided she would believe in herself. She did not need approval. She needed endurance. As a teenager, she was introduced to something that would change her forever: the trials that would later give her the mark of the Black Viper. They were not official to the public, not part of some shiny program with cameras or medals. They were whispered about in certain circles, brutal and unforgiving. People said those trials were meant to break the weak and shape the strong. She knew immediately that she had to face them, not because she wanted the tattoo, not because she wanted glory, but because she wanted to prove to herself that her life had not been defined by the pain of her childhood. The trials pushed her into places most would never dare to go. Endless days of crawling through mud, carrying weights that bent her shoulders until they bruised, moving across landscapes with no water, no rest, no comfort. Nights of freezing winds that cut through her bones and left her teeth chattering so loudly, she thought they would break. Hunger so sharp it felt like knives cutting into her stomach. And always the silence where doubt became the loudest voice. It was not just the physical pain that tested her. It was the mental war inside her head. Voices of her past echoed every time she wanted to stop. Foster parents who had called her worthless, classmates who had laughed at her, moments when she had been left behind, unwanted and unseen. All of those voices returned in the darkness, urging her to quit, to accept that she was nothing. But she refused. Every step she took in that trial was not just for survival. It was for the child she once was, the lonely girl who had cried into her pillow at night, the young teenager who had looked in the mirror and asked why she had not been enough for anyone to stay. Every blister on her feet, every ache in her muscles, every drop of blood was proof that she was rewriting her story. She would not be defined by what she had lost. She would be defined by what she could endure. When the trials ended, only a handful of people remained. And when they gave her the Black Viper tattoo, pressing the ink into her skin, she did not cry. She looked at the coiled snake etched into her arm and knew it was more than just a mark. It was her history, her pain, and her victory all bound into one. That viper was not there to scare others. It was there to remind her that she had survived what was meant to destroy her. Now, as she lay on the barracks bed, staring at the ceiling, she remembered all of it. The sergeant's insult earlier in the day had been nothing compared to the voices she had fought in her own mind. His attempt to break her spirit had only reminded her of how far she had come. She was not the child left behind anymore. She was not the unwanted teenager anymore. She was not the girl mocked by her peers anymore. She was the woman who had survived the trials, the woman who carried the viper, the woman who would not bow to anyone's attempt to define her. Outside, the night was silent except for the occasional sound of boots on gravel as guards patrolled the perimeter. The recruits around her slowly drifted into restless sleep, some muttering in dreams, others twisting in their blankets. She lay still, calm, her breathing steady. She was not afraid of what tomorrow would bring. She had already faced worse. The past had been brutal. The past had been lonely. The past had been filled with shadows. But it was because of that past that she now stood stronger than anyone could see. Every scar she carried, both visible and hidden, had been a stepping stone to this moment. The sergeant might have thought a mop would humiliate her. The recruits might have thought laughter would weaken her. But they did not know the truth. She had already endured struggles far greater, and she had already walked through fires that none of them could imagine. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new drills, new battles. But she was ready, because the woman who bore the Black Viper tattoo was not just another recruit. She was a survivor of a past so harsh it had tried to erase her, and she was still standing, and that was her greatest strength. The next morning came with the sound of whistles and boots pounding against the gravel outside the barracks. The recruits hurried into formation, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, their bodies aching from the previous day's drills. The woman rose quietly, pulling on her uniform with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. She did not complain, did not groan about the soreness in her muscles, did not join in the chatter that buzzed among the others. She moved like someone who had already mastered the art of discipline long before she arrived here. The sergeant stood waiting, his presence as heavy as the air itself. He barked orders in his sharp tone, pushing the recruits to run laps, drop for push-ups, climb ropes, and drag heavy loads across the training ground. The heat of the sun pressed down on them, and within an hour, sweat poured from every face, uniform soaked through, hands blistered, knees scraped. Some recruits grunted in frustration, some fell behind, and others cursed under their breath as they stumbled through the drills. But she did not curse. She did not complain. She kept moving, steady and determined, her focus never breaking. The men around her noticed. At first, some mocked her in quiet whispers, the same way they had when the sergeant handed her the mop. They said she was only keeping up because she wanted to prove something. They said she was stubborn. They said she was trying too hard. But as the hours dragged on, their laughter faded. When they slowed, she kept going. When they dropped, she stood tall. When they complained, she stayed silent. She was not trying to outshine anyone, yet her consistency made her shine without effort. It was not about showing off. It was about refusing to quit. By midday, the recruits were called to line up again. Their uniforms were smeared with dirt, their faces red with exhaustion. The sergeant paced in front of them, his eyes scanning the group. His gaze lingered on the woman once more. He had tested her yesterday with mockery, but today he was watching her in a different light. She had endured every drill without faltering, without needing to be singled out, without demanding recognition, and in her endurance, something had become undeniable. She was breaking every expectation that had been placed on her. The truth was, many had not expected her to last this long, not because she lacked strength, but because the system itself was built on stereotypes. Women were often assumed to be weaker, softer, less suited for the grind of military life. Recruits whispered it in the barracks. Older soldiers muttered it under their breath, and even some leaders carried the bias quietly in their minds. But every lap she ran, every obstacle she climbed, every weight she carried was a silent strike against that stereotype. She was not only surviving here, she was excelling. Later that evening, when they were given chores to complete, the sergeant again gave her the kind of task most recruits would call humiliating: cleaning the equipment shed. Dust filled the air, cobwebs clung to the corners, and broken tools lay scattered across the floor. Many would have groaned, complained, or muttered about unfair treatment. But she did none of that. She walked into the shed, rolled up her sleeves, and began her work. The others watched through the doorway, waiting for some sign of bitterness on her face, some slip of frustration in her movements. But there was none. She cleaned with the same precision she had used with the mop the day before. Every stroke, every sweep, every motion was deliberate. She did not treat the chore as beneath her. Instead, she treated it as part of her discipline, part of her training, part of her endurance. When she finished, the shed looked different. The dust was gone, the tools were neatly arranged, and the floor shined faintly under the dim light. The recruits standing nearby were silent, unsure of how to respond. For them, it had been a chore. For her, it had been a chance to show that no task, no matter how small, was unworthy of her effort. That was the moment the whispers began to shift. At night, lying in their bunks, some recruits began talking differently. Instead of mocking, they spoke with curiosity. "How does she keep going?" one asked. "She never complains," said another. "It's like nothing gets to her." They could not fully understand it, but they were beginning to respect it. They had laughed at her once, but now they were starting to learn from her without even realizing it. The sergeant noticed it too. He had not said anything about the tattoo since that first day, but the image of it burned in his mind. It had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that strength is not defined by what people expect, but by what people endure. Watching her work, watching her run, watching her refuse to bend under pressure, he realized that she was breaking more than stereotypes. She was breaking the silence inside others. She was forcing them to see that excuses had no place here, that bias had no place here, that true strength could not be denied. But the woman did not think about any of this. She did not see herself as a symbol, did not wake up each day planning to inspire anyone. She simply lived by the rule she had always carried: never quit, never complain, and never let others decide your worth. Her past had taught her that no one was coming to save her. The only person who could decide her path was herself. So every day she carried that same determination, and every day it carried her further than most could go. One evening, after a long day of drills, one of the younger recruits approached her quietly. He was hesitant, shifting nervously as if he was not sure he should speak. Finally, he said, "How do you do it?" "You don't stop. You don't get tired like us." She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, almost unnoticeable smile. "I do get tired," she said softly. "I just don't let it decide for me." The boy nodded slowly, her words sinking deeper than she realized. He went back to his bunk, but her answer stayed with him. And slowly, the same lesson began to spread. Day after day, drill after drill, chore after chore, she kept moving. And little by little, the laughter was replaced with silence, then respect, then admiration. The stereotypes that had seemed so heavy at first began to crumble, not because she argued against them, but because she shattered them through her actions. By the end of that week, the recruits no longer looked at her as the woman holding a mop. They looked at her as one of them, strong, unshakable, and worthy of the same respect they gave anyone else who refused to quit. And though she never said it aloud, she knew in her heart that she had achieved something greater than surviving the drills. She had proven that breaking stereotypes was not about words, not about arguments, not about fighting against every opinion. It was about living in a way that made those stereotypes impossible to believe. And that was exactly what she was doing. The sun rose higher in the sky as the days of training stretched on. What had once been laughter behind her back had now grown into silence, and what had once been doubt had begun to turn into something else entirely. Respect is not given easily in a place where every recruit is struggling for survival. But slowly, almost quietly, she began to earn it in ways that no one could deny. It happened in small moments at first. During long runs across the training grounds when others slowed, she kept her steady pace, neither rushing to show off nor falling behind to make excuses. She was always there, pushing forward one step at a time, her eyes fixed straight ahead. When one recruit twisted his ankle on the rough path, the group scattered, unsure of what to do. She did not hesitate. She moved to his side, helped him up, and half-carried him until they reached the end. She did not ask for recognition. She did not wait for applause. She simply did what needed to be done. At the shooting range, where hands shook and nerves made even the bravest recruits fumble with their aim, she remained calm. Her breathing was steady, her posture firm, her focus clear. She did not hit the bullseye every time, but the consistency of her effort was impossible to miss. She never grew frustrated when she missed, never cursed under her breath like the others. She adjusted, breathed, and tried again. Slowly, recruits who once ignored her began to watch her movements, trying to copy her rhythm, her calmness, her control. Without realizing it, they were learning from her. The sergeant noticed this change, though he said nothing at first. He watched her with the same sharp eyes, but deep inside his perspective had shifted. Where he once saw someone to test, he now saw someone who carried her own weight without faltering. He remembered his first attempt to break her with the mop, and the image of her silent defiance remained sharp in his mind. The black viper tattoo had spoken louder than words ever could, but it was not the tattoo alone that demanded his respect. It was how she carried herself every single day since then. One afternoon, after hours of drills under the harsh sun, the recruits were ordered to run obstacle courses as a group. The walls were high, the ropes slick with sweat, and the mud pits deeper than they looked. Many recruits groaned, dragging their feet, their energy nearly gone. The sergeant barked orders, his voice cutting through the air, but their movements grew sluggish. When one recruit slipped back down a wall for the third time, frustration took over and he punched the dirt, cursing loudly. The others watched, too tired to help, too focused on saving their own strength. But she stepped forward. She crouched down, laced her fingers together, and offered him a foothold. He looked at her in surprise, but she nodded once, her expression calm and certain. Reluctantly, he placed his boot in her hands, and with a push of strength that startled him, She lifted him high enough to grip the top of the wall. He pulled himself over, landing on the other side, breathing heavily but smiling in relief. The sergeant, who had been watching silently, made no comment. But in that moment he saw how her strength was not only lifting herself but lifting others. Respect began to show itself in subtle ways. When the recruits lined up for meals, those who once cut in front of her began stepping aside, letting her pass without a word. In the barracks, when exhaustion made tempers flare, her calm voice often settled arguments before they became fights. When drills left them breathless and sore, some began to glance her way, almost as if checking if she was still moving forward, and when they saw that she was, they found the strength to keep moving too. The transformation was slow, but it was real. One night, after another brutal day of training, the recruits sat in silence in their bunks. The sergeant had pushed them harder than usual, leaving most of them too exhausted to even talk. But then one voice broke the silence. "You know," a young recruit said quietly, glancing toward her bed. "I thought she'd quit the first week." Another chuckled softly, not out of mockery but almost in disbelief. "So did I, but she didn't," a third recruit added. "She never does." For a moment the barracks was filled with quiet nods of agreement. No one laughed at her anymore. No one called her names. The silence carried something new, acknowledgement. She had earned it, not through speeches or demands, but through the unshakable weight of her actions. The sergeant saw it too. Weeks had passed since the mop incident, but he still thought about it. At first he had meant to teach her her place, to remind her of the harshness of this world. But now he realized she had taught him something instead, that leadership is not always about shouting the loudest or holding the highest rank. Sometimes leadership begins with one person who refuses to quit. One person who shows by example what endurance really looks like. One afternoon, when the group was given a short break, the sergeant called her aside. His voice was not mocking this time. It was firm but quieter than usual. "You know why I gave you that mop," he said, looking at her directly. She nodded once but did not answer. "I expected you to break," he admitted, his tone carrying something almost like respect. "But you didn't, and now they look at you differently." He motioned toward the recruits who were sitting nearby, laughing and sharing water bottles, their earlier divisions fading into something more united. She met his gaze but said nothing. She did not need to. The sergeant gave a single nod before walking away, but his words remained heavy in her chest. It was not praise she had been seeking, but the truth in his voice mattered. Respect had been earned, and it was not just from the recruits, it was from him too. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with shades of red and gold, she sat quietly on the edge of her bunk. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the lonely childhood, the trials that had left scars on her body and soul, the black viper that curled along her arm as a reminder of survival. She realized now that every struggle had prepared her for this moment, not to prove herself to others, but to stand tall for herself. And in doing so, she had changed the way others saw her too. Respect is never given easily. It is not found in words, nor is it demanded. It is earned through quiet endurance, through acts that speak louder than speeches, through strength that does not need to be announced. She had shown them all that respect is not tied to gender, not tied to stereotypes, not tied to what others expect. It is tied to character, to resilience, to the refusal to quit no matter what is thrown your way. That night, as the recruits drifted into sleep, one thought settled deeply into her heart. She had come here to train, but she had done more than that. She had begun to change the space around her. She had shown them not who she was expected to be, but who she truly was, and that was respect earned in its truest form. The days of training stretched into weeks, and slowly the recruits began to change. The rough edges of arrogance wore down, the careless jokes disappeared, and the silence of exhaustion was replaced by a new kind of unity. They were no longer a scattered group of strangers trying to prove themselves. They were beginning to form the outlines of a team. And at the center of that transformation, though no one spoke it aloud, was the woman with the black viper tattoo. Every morning she rose with the same calm discipline, moving with steady rhythm as if she had been made for this life. She never demanded attention, yet her presence alone demanded it. The recruits had started to copy her habits, waking a little earlier to prepare, checking their boots twice before drills, running with steadier pace instead of burning out quickly. They were learning without realizing they were being taught, and she never tried to claim the role of teacher. She simply lived her values and the others followed. The sergeant watched this shift with keen eyes. At first he had resisted it. He had told himself that what he was seeing was temporary, that the recruits were only drawn to her discipline because it was new. But with each passing week it became harder to deny. The group that had once been filled with division and rivalry was beginning to move as one. When one fell, the others helped. When one struggled, they slowed together. The selfishness that often plagued young soldiers was being replaced with something more powerful: unity. And at the heart of it was the quiet strength of one woman who had never asked for the spotlight. The turning point came during one of the most brutal days of training yet. The sergeant had prepared a full course meant to break even the strongest recruits. It was not just about physical strength, but about teamwork, endurance, and mental grit. The recruits were tasked to move heavy logs across uneven terrain, climb walls slick with mud, crawl under barbed wire, and then carry a wounded comrade simulation for miles. Many groaned when they heard the instructions. Some muttered that it was impossible. The sergeant only smirked, his voice cold as he barked, "Begin." The first stage nearly drained them. The logs were heavier than expected, biting into shoulders, scraping skin raw. Some staggered, some cursed, and some nearly dropped their share. But the woman held her position firmly. Her shoulders bent but did not break. She kept her pace steady, her breathing calm, her focus locked. Those beside her drew strength from her presence. When one recruit slipped and the log tilted dangerously, she shifted quickly, bearing more weight on her own until the group steadied. They looked at her in shock, realizing how much strength she carried without complaint. The wall climb came next. The surface was coated with mud, slick and nearly impossible to grip. One by one, recruits tried and failed, sliding back down with groans of frustration. The sergeant barked at them to try again, his voice sharp and unforgiving. The woman stepped forward without hesitation. She pressed her palms into the mud, dug her boots into the smallest crevices, and pulled herself upward with calm precision. The wall fought against her, but she refused to let go. Inch by inch, she rose higher until she finally gripped the top and pulled herself over. On the other side, she turned back, crouched down, and extended her arm. One by one, she helped the others up, her hand steady and sure. By the time they reached the final stage, the wounded carry, the recruits were beyond exhausted. They were told to lift one of their own onto a stretcher and carry him across miles of rough ground, through hills and streams, without stopping. The weight dragged at their muscles, sweat burned their eyes, and their breath came in ragged gasps. Some stumbled, ready to collapse. The sergeant watched, waiting for them to break, but she would not let them. When one recruit's grip slipped, she took his side without a word, lifting more weight than her frame should have allowed. When another stumbled in the stream, she encouraged him, her voice calm and steady. "One step at a time," she said softly, her tone carrying more power than a shout ever could. And slowly, step by step, mile by mile, they moved forward together. By the time they reached the finish, they were trembling, their bodies pushed past limits they had never known. They dropped to the ground, gasping, covered in mud, their uniforms clinging to their skin. The sergeant stood before them, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his eyes shifted to her and he gave the smallest nod, a nod not of authority but of acknowledgement. The recruits noticed. They had never seen the sergeant nod to anyone like that. And in that silent gesture they realized something. She had not only earned their respect, but she had earned his as well. That night, in the barracks, the air felt different. The recruits did not just talk among themselves, they talked to her. They asked her how she kept her calm, how she pushed through when her body screamed to stop, how she endured when everything seemed impossible. She did not give grand speeches. She only told them the truth. "You don't have to be the strongest," she said. "You just have to refuse to quit. That's all." Her words settled deep into their hearts. Many lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had said. They realized that what made her different was not that she was never tired, never afraid, or never in pain. It was that she refused to let those feelings make her surrender. That was the turning point, not just for her, but for the entire group. The sergeant knew it too. He had been in the army long enough to see leaders rise and fall, to see soldiers break under pressure. He had believed for years that leadership was something he had to force into recruits with sharp words and relentless tests. But now, watching the transformation of his group, he saw a different kind of leadership. It was not loud. It was not demanding. It was quiet, consistent, and unshakable. And it had come from the woman he had once tried to humiliate with a mop. The turning point had come not because she demanded respect, but because she lived in a way that made respect unavoidable. She had shown them all that endurance was not just about finishing drills, but about carrying yourself with dignity no matter what burden you were asked to bear. As the weeks ahead promised even harder challenges, one thing had become clear. The recruits were no longer looking to the sergeant alone for guidance. They were looking to her. And though she never asked for it, she had become something more than a fellow recruit. She had become the example they all followed. The turning point had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks of training slowly turned into months, and the recruits who had once entered the camp as individuals full of pride, fear, or doubt were no longer the same. They had been reshaped by sweat, discipline, and endless trials that demanded more than they thought they had. Some had broken, some had grown stronger, and all had learned what it meant to carry the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. But within that group, one presence stood apart. Not because she demanded to be different, but because her actions had made her unforgettable. The woman with the black viper tattoo had left a mark on the training grounds that would not fade with time. Her legacy began in the small things. The recruits no longer laughed at her. They looked to her. When a task seemed impossible, when their bodies screamed to stop, they found themselves glancing in her direction. If she was still moving, they kept moving. If she was still standing, they pushed themselves to stand as well. Her calm had become their strength. Her silence had become their reassurance. And her endurance had become their standard. They began to realize that leadership did not always come from the loudest voice or the highest rank. Sometimes it came from the one who refused to fall, even when the ground itself seemed determined to pull them down. The sergeant felt it too. Though he never openly said it, his treatment of her had changed. The mocking tone was gone. The unnecessary tests meant to humiliate her had disappeared. Instead, he gave her the same hard drills as everyone else, but in his eyes there was something new: respect. He knew that she had already faced more trials than most of them ever would. He knew that she carried not only her own burdens, but often the weight of those around her. And he knew that when the time came for these recruits to face the real challenges of service, it would be her strength that many of them leaned on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the training grounds in gold and crimson light, the sergeant called the recruits together. They stood in a wide circle, sweat and dirt clinging to their uniforms after a long day of drills. His voice carried across the group, rough but steady. "You came here as individuals," he said, "but now you are learning what it means to be a unit, to depend on each other, to rise together or to fall together. And in that process, you all know who kept you standing when you wanted to quit." His eyes shifted toward her, just for a moment before scanning the rest again. The recruits followed his gaze, and though no one spoke, they all knew the truth. She had been their anchor, their quiet reminder that no obstacle was too high, no weight too heavy, no insult too sharp. She had never asked to lead them, but she had become their leader all the same. Later that night, as they sat in the barracks, one of the younger recruits broke the silence. "When this training is over, they'll spread us out, send us to different places. But I'll never forget what she taught me." Another nodded, adding softly, "Me neither. She taught us that quitting is a choice, and she never made it." The room grew quiet again, each recruit lost in thought, realizing how deeply her example had shaped them. The woman herself did not think about legacy. She did not think about what the others saw in her. For her, every day was simply another step forward, another chance to prove to herself that she could endure. She never sought glory, never sought to stand above anyone else. Her only goal was to face each trial with the same unshakable resolve she had carried since childhood. Yet without meaning to, she had become more than a survivor. She had become a symbol. The black viper tattoo was more than ink. It was a reminder that she had walked through trials designed to break the human spirit and had come out alive. It was a symbol of patience, endurance, and strength that did not bend under the weight of the world. And though the recruits did not know the full story behind it, they understood what it meant simply by watching her live. They saw that the viper was not just on her arm. It was in her spirit, coiled and ready, unyielding and alive. When the final weeks of training arrived, the recruits were pushed into their last and most grueling test. They were dropped into unfamiliar terrain, ordered to navigate with little food or rest, and required to work together to complete impossible tasks. It was the culmination of everything they had been taught, the point where many would break. But they did not break, not this time, because this time they had learned how to carry themselves differently. They encouraged each other, pushed each other, and refused to let anyone fall behind. And when exhaustion clawed at them, when despair whispered that it was easier to quit, they remembered her example and kept moving. At the end of the test, when they staggered back into camp, broken but not defeated, the sergeant looked at them with something rare in his eyes, pride. He did not single anyone out, but everyone knew that without her they would not have made it through as a unit. She had changed them, reshaped them, and given them something they would carry for the rest of their lives. On the final evening before graduation, the recruits gathered quietly outside the barracks. The stars stretched across the night sky, bright and endless. They sat together, talking in low voices, sharing memories of how they had once laughed at her, doubted her, and underestimated her. Now none of them could imagine the training without her presence. She had gone from the one mocked to the one they trusted most, and though they did not say it directly to her, their eyes carried gratitude every time they looked her way. The sergeant approached her one last time before the ceremony. He stood in front of her, his face lined with years of service, his eyes steady. "You came here with more strength than I expected," he said quietly, "and you leave here with more respect than most ever earn." He extended his hand, not as a command, not as a superior testing a subordinate, but as a soldier honoring another. For a moment she hesitated, then clasped his hand firmly. It was not victory she felt, but acknowledgement, the kind that could never be faked or forced. The next day, as the recruits stood in uniform, ready to graduate, the woman stood among them, calm and steady as always. She did not smile, did not seek the eyes of the crowd, did not bask in the moment. She simply stood tall, knowing that she had endured and that enduring was enough. Yet as the ceremony ended and the recruits prepared to leave for their separate paths, each of them carried a piece of her with them. They carried her lessons, her example, and her strength. The legacy of the Viper was not written in books or shouted in speeches. It was written in the quiet resolve of one woman who refused to break. It was etched into the memory of every recruit who had trained beside her. And it was carried in the respect of a sergeant who had once underestimated her, but who would never make that mistake again.